A pale, dusty sky stretched over the unforgiving landscape of New Mexico territory. Fall of 1882. The wind carried whispers of winter, though the sun still beat down mercilessly during daylight hours. This was a land where the boundary between life and death was as thin as smoke, where survival depended on wits, strength, and sometimes the kindness of strangers. The sandstorm came without warning. One moment the horizon was clear. The next, a wall of churning dust advanced like an army, swallowing everything in its path. Jedediah Jed Sullivan pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, squinting against the assault. His mule, a stubborn beast named Saul, brayed in protest as sand whipped against them. "Easy now," Jed muttered, patting the animal's neck. "We'll find shelter." At 42, Jed's face was weathered like the landscape he traversed, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. Once a military chaplain, now a freight hauler, he carried supplies between isolated settlements, forts, and trading posts. The war had taken his faith. The years since had taken his hope. All that remained was a quiet determination to keep moving, to outpace the ghosts that followed him. The storm intensified. Jed could barely see 5 feet ahead. Saul stumbled, nearly sending the crates of goods sliding from his back. Cursing under his breath, Jed tugged the animal toward what looked like a rock formation, potential shelter until the worst passed. That's when he heard it. Voices carried on the wind, human voices shouting orders. Curiosity overcame caution. Jed secured Saul in the lee of a boulder and crept forward, bent against the stinging sand. Through the haze of dust, he made out shapes: horses, wagons, men with rifles, and something else. A line of figures shuffling forward, heads down, linked together. Chains. They wore chains. Jed's stomach clenched. He'd seen such processions during the war, prisoners being transported, but these weren't soldiers or criminals. Even through the billowing sand, he could make out the distinctive clothing and dark skin of native people. Apache, most likely. One figure stood out among the rest. A woman, taller than most men in the line, shoulders broad, head unbowed despite the conditions. As if sensing his gaze, she turned in Jed's direction. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the swirling dust. Dark, fierce eyes that seemed to pierce straight to his soul. Jed froze. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, though he knew he'd never seen this woman before. Yet something about her was hauntingly familiar. Before he could process the thought, a guard shoved the woman forward. The moment broke. The procession disappeared into the storm, leaving Jed staring after them, heart hammering in his chest. That night, camped in a small ravine with the storm finally past, Jed couldn't shake the woman's image from his mind. He'd had the dream again, the same one that had haunted him for years. A native woman standing on a hill, calling his name, then vanishing in flames. Always the same, always leaving him gasping awake, drenched in sweat. But tonight, the woman in his dream had the face of the prisoner from the sandstorm. Just coincidence, he muttered to himself, stoking the small campfire. Mind playing tricks. Yet deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about the encounter had shaken loose the foundations of his carefully constructed indifference. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something he thought long dead. Purpose. Serpent's Fork came into view the next day, a rough collection of wooden buildings clustered around a trading post. The settlement thrived on the traffic of prospectors, fur trappers, and merchants passing through the territory. It was a place where a man could find supplies, information, or trouble depending on what he sought. Jed guided Saul down the main street, nodding to familiar faces. He'd been hauling freight through these parts for 5 years, long enough to be recognized but not long enough to be considered local. That suited him fine. Attachment meant vulnerability, and Jed had learned that lesson the hard way. The trading post was busier than usual. Men gathered in the yard behind it, forming a loose circle around something Jed couldn't see. Raucous laughter and jeers rose from the crowd. Curious, he tied Saul to a hitching post and approached. "What's the commotion?" he asked a grizzled prospector leaning against the fence. "Auction," the man replied without looking at him. "Special merchandise." Jed pushed his way forward, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. The crowd parted just enough for him to see, and the world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The woman from the sandstorm stood between 2 iron posts, heavy chains binding her wrists. Her deerskin dress was torn, exposing more skin than was decent. A bright red X had been burned into her left shoulder, the skin still raw and blistered. Despite her circumstances, she stood tall, eyes forward, expression impassive. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like gravel, gestured toward her with his cane. "Unfit for womanly use," he announced to scattered chuckles. "Too big to breed, not claimed by any authority. Sold as meat to recover losses." Coins clinked against wood as men made half-hearted bids. A butcher in a stained apron eyed her critically, already calculating the cuts he could get. Jed felt sick. He'd seen humanity at its worst during the war. Men reduced to animals, life rendered worthless. He thought he'd built calluses over those memories, learned to look away when the world showed its ugliness. But something about this scene cut through his carefully constructed indifference. The woman's eyes swept across the crowd, landing briefly on Jed. No recognition flickered there, just a steady assessment, measuring distances, calculating chances. Jed's hand moved to his satchel, fingers brushing the worn leather Bible he still carried, despite having lost faith in its words. Beside it lay a small brass seal with an eagle stamped into it, a relic from his military days that he'd kept for reasons he couldn't articulate. The auctioneer raised his hands. "No bids? Then we settle the matter with a knife." He signaled to the butcher, who stepped forward, blade glinting in the afternoon sun. Time seemed to slow. Jed saw himself walking away, heard the practical voice in his head urging him to mind his own business. One woman's fate against his own safety. The math was simple. But another voice, one he hadn't heard in years, whispered of duty, of the sin of standing silent before evil. Before he could second-guess himself, Jed stepped forward, not rushing, not calling attention, just moving with purpose toward the auctioneer's platform. He placed his satchel on the top rail and took out the brass seal, along with some freight papers. "Federal Missionary Registry," he said, voice calm but caring. "This woman is listed under the Anglican Church's special conversion program, confiscated from improper sale pending inspection." He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just spoke with the quiet authority of a man who expected to be obeyed. The auctioneer's smile faltered. "Ain't seen no papers on her." "Filed last week in Santa Fe," Jed replied, placing the eagle seal atop his documents. "Take it up with the territorial governor if you've complaints." A murmur ran through the crowd. The butcher looked uncertainly at the auctioneer, who in turn glanced at the assembled men. No one wanted trouble with federal authorities, especially over a native woman no one particularly valued. Jed didn't wait for permission. He moved to the post, lifted the chain from its hook, and wrapped the slack around his forearm. He kept a small distance between himself and the woman, not touching her skin, not pushing. "Walk," he said quietly, using the tone he'd once used with frightened horses. She didn't hesitate, moving when he moved. They passed through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. Boots scuffed dirt. Someone spat, the glob landing inches from Jed's boot. No one blocked their way. Outside the yard, away from prying eyes, Jed stopped beside his mule and turned to the woman for the first time at close distance. He examined the brand on her shoulder, anger flaring despite his attempt at detachment. "Water," he said, pointing to a barrel by the wall. She watched his hands, his eyes, searching for mockery or threat. Finding neither, she stepped to the barrel and drank in steady sips, not rushing despite obvious thirst. Two clerks from the store emerged onto the porch, watching with undisguised interest. The auctioneer lingered by the gate, pretending to inspect some rope while keeping an eye on them. Jed opened one of his ledgers and scribbled a few lines about taking custody of a federal ward, pressing the eagle seal onto the page for show. He left the book open on the fence post where anyone curious could see it. "I'm leaving now," he told the woman. "You can come with me. It's 8 miles to shelter. Better than here." He waited, giving her the dignity of choice, though they both knew her options were limited. She studied him, then looked back at the trading post, at the men watching them, at the butcher's knife gleaming on his belt. Without a word, she nodded once. Jed arranged the chain across the mule's pack to hide it from distant observers. He untied Saul, checked the supplies were secure, and started walking, leading the mule by its bridle. The woman fell into step beside him, her stride long and steady despite exhaustion evident in the set of her shoulders. As they left Serpent's Fork behind, Jed took quick inventory of his situation. One mule, 3 crates of supplies, a half-empty water barrel, a small cabin by Eagle Creek, and a strange woman walking beside him who'd been destined for butchering an hour ago. The weight of his decisions settled across his shoulders like a physical burden, yet for the first time in years he felt something like peace. "My name is Jedediah," he said after they'd put a mile between themselves and the trading post. "Jed Sullivan. I haul freight. I don't own people." She looked at him, dark eyes assessing. After a long moment she spoke, her voice low but clear. "Nahimana. That's your name?" She nodded. "Means spirit thunder." Jed nodded, surprised she spoke English and curious about her background. But he didn't press. They had miles to go before nightfall, and questions could wait. They walked in silence as the sun began its descent, painting the desert in amber and gold. Jed scanned the horizon periodically, watching for riders from Serpent's Fork, but the trail remained empty. Still, he kept his hand near the revolver at his hip, a precaution he hoped wouldn't prove necessary. His cabin came into view just as dusk was settling, a simple one-room structure of logs and stone nestled against a rocky outcropping near a small creek. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter and privacy, 2 things Jed valued above comfort. "Home," he said simply, gesturing toward the cabin. Nahimana studied the structure, then the surrounding terrain, with a strategist's eye. He noticed how she marked the distances, the escape routes, the defensible positions. She was thinking like someone who expected to need to run. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot in another. A table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and a few books. A rifle hung above the door. Jed lit a lamp, its glow chasing shadows into the corners. He set about starting a fire in the stove, aware of Nahimana standing just inside the doorway, still as a statue. "You can sit," he said, nodding toward a chair. She remained standing, eyes traveling the room, marking exits, assessing threats. The chain still hung from her wrists. Jed found his toolbox, retrieved a file and hammer. "Let's get those off," he said, approaching slowly. Nahimana tensed, eyes narrowing. "The chains," Jed clarified, holding up the tools. "No one wears chains in my house." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She extended her wrists, watching carefully as Jed worked the file against the iron links. It took time. The chains were sturdy, but eventually they gave way. The shackles remained, but at least she was no longer bound. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jed nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. "You're hungry. I'll make food." He set a pot of beans to simmer on the stove, adding a strip of salt pork for flavor. While it cooked, he filled a basin with water and placed it on the table along with a clean cloth and a jar of bear grease salve. "For your shoulder," he explained, gesturing to the burn. "Do it yourself if you prefer." He turned back to the stove, giving her privacy. After a moment, he heard the soft splash of water as she began cleaning the wound. Her breath hissed once between her teeth, the only indication of pain she allowed herself. When the food was ready, Jed filled 2 bowls and placed one before her. "Eat," he said simply. They ate in silence, the only sound the occasional crackle from the stove and the scrape of spoons against tin. Jed watched discreetly as Nahimana ate, measured, controlled, each bite carefully chewed. Not the frantic consumption of someone starved, but the deliberate intake of someone who had learned food could be withheld as punishment. After they finished, Jed took a worn blanket from a chest and offered it to her arm. "You can sleep by the stove," he said, pointing to the warmest corner of the cabin. "I'll take the cot." Nahimana accepted the blanket with a slight nod. She spread it near the stove and sat cross-legged atop it, back straight, hands resting on her knees. She watched as Jed checked the door latch, banked the fire for the night, and finally stretched out on his cot, one hand resting near his revolver. The night deepened around them. Through the small window, stars appeared one by one, cold and distant. Jed stared at the ceiling, sleep eluding him despite bone-deep weariness. His mind kept returning to the woman sitting silent across the room, to the dream that had plagued him for years, to the strange sense that some invisible hand had guided today's events. "Wait, Aang," the question came so softly he almost missed it. Jed propped himself up on one elbow, looking toward Nahimana. In the dim glow from the stove, her profile was strong, almost severe. "Why what?" he asked. "Why save me? You wear no collar. Not a real missionary." Jed considered lying, then decided against it. "I don't know," he admitted. "Seemed wrong to let a person be butchered for meat." She turned to face him fully. Many would not stop it. Many would watch. "I've watched too much already," Jed said, the words coming before he could stop them. "Done too much watching and not enough stopping." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps recognition. They were both survivors, both carrying burdens invisible to others. "Sleep," Jed said finally. "No one will harm you here." She didn't reply, but as the night wore on, he noticed her posture gradually relax, her breathing deepen. Eventually she lay down, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, back to the wall, face toward the door. Even in sleep, she remained vigilant. Jed closed his eyes, expecting the usual nightmares. Instead, for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming. Morning came with pale light filtering through the window and birdsong from the creek. Jed woke instantly, a habit from years of travel through dangerous country. He rolled to his side, checking first that Nahimana was still there, then that his revolver remained within reach. She slept on, the first deep rest she'd likely had in weeks. Jed moved quietly, building up the fire in the stove and putting coffee on to boil. The familiar routine steadied him, giving his hands purpose while his mind worked through the implications of yesterday's actions. He'd broken no law, technically. The woman hadn't been legally owned, merely captured and exploited. But he'd interfered in local commerce, used false authority, and potentially made enemies. Sooner or later, someone would come asking the questions. The smell of coffee roused Nahimana. She sat up in one fluid motion, instantly alert, eyes finding Jed by the stove. "Morning, he said, pouring the dark liquid into 2 tin cups. "Coffee's hot." She accepted the cup with both hands, the gesture almost reverent. "Thank you." They drank in companionable silence, each wrapped in private thoughts. Outside, the day promised to be clear and cool, a reprieve before winter set in earnest. "What now?" Nahimana asked finally, setting her empty cup on the floor beside her blanket. It was a fair question, one Jed had been turning over all night. "You're free to go," he said, "but these parts aren't safe for a lone Apache woman. You're welcome to stay until you decide what's next." She studied him, weighing his words against his actions. "Why help an Apache? Your people and mine. Not friends." "I don't have people anymore," Jed replied. "Haven't for a long time." Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps that cut through the morning quiet. Jed grabbed his revolver, motioning for Nahimana to move to the corner, farthest from the door. She complied silently, gathering the blanket around her like a shield. "Who's there?" Jed called, positioning himself beside the door, gun ready. "It's Ezra, you suspicious old goat. Open up before I freeze solid." Jed relaxed, though only slightly. He unlatched the door, opening it just enough to confirm the visitor's identity before swinging it wide. Ezra Coleman stepped inside, stomping trail dust from his boots. At 65, he was lean and tough as old leather, with a face creased by sun and wind. A former soldier turned blacksmith, he now ran the forge at Serpent's Fork and was one of the few men Jed counted as a friend. Ezra's eyes immediately found Nahimana in the corner. "So it's true," he said, turning back to Jed with raised eyebrows. "You've gone and done it now, haven't you?" "Done what?" Jed asked, closing the door and holstering his weapon. "Half the trading post is talking about how Chaplain Sullivan claimed a native woman under some missionary program." Ezra shook his head. "Bold move, even for you." "She was going to be butchered," Jed said flatly. "I know." Ezra's expression softened. "Not judging you, son. Just saying you've stirred up a hornet's nest. The butcher's pride is wounded, and some others are asking questions about this missionary program no one's heard of." Jed sighed, pouring a cup of coffee for his visitor. "Figured as much. They planning to come after her?" "Not immediately. Most folks have more pressing concerns." Ezra accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "But there's something else you should know." He glanced at Nahimana, then lowered his voice. "The border guardians are growing stronger." Jed frowned. "The militia group?" They call themselves militia. I call them murderers with permission. Ezra's voice hardened. They've been raiding Apache camps all across the territory, claiming they're responding to attacks on settlers. But I've been hearing things. Whispers about plans for something bigger. Something that's got government support. What kind of something? Jed asked, unease crawling up his spine. Cleansing, they call it. Clearing the territory of hostile elements once and for all. Ezra took a long drink of coffee. Been collecting evidence. Letters, orders, accounts of massacres that never made the newspapers. Planning to send it all to a senator in Washington who still gives a damn about justice. Nahimana had moved closer during this exchange, listening intently. Now she spoke, her voice low but clear. You know of attacks on my people? Ezra turned to her, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Yes, ma'am, I do. More than most would believe. Who leads these border guardians? She asked. Man named Luther Maxwell, ex-military chaplain if you can believe it, uses scripture to justify slaughter. Ezra gave Jed a meaningful look. You might remember him from the war. Jed's blood ran cold. Maxwell, of course it would be Maxwell. The man had been his superior during the war, a chaplain whose sermons had been more about righteous vengeance than mercy or forgiveness. Jed had served under him for 2 years before requesting a transfer, unable to stomach the man's particular brand of faith. Maxwell's here? In the territory? Jed asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Ezra nodded grimly. Arrived 6 months ago, with a mandate from someone high up. Been recruiting men, stockpiling weapons. They're planning something big, and soon. Nahimana's eyes had never left Jed's face during this exchange. Now she asked, You know this man? I served with him, Jed admitted. He was zealous, believed God had chosen white Americans to claim this continent, no matter the cost. He still believes that, Ezra said. Only now he's got the authority and the men to act on it. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jed felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. Years of careful isolation crumbling in the face of a threat he couldn't ignore. You should leave the territory, he told Nahimana. Head north, maybe. Find somewhere safer. She shook her head. No place is safe for my people now, and I have nowhere to go. Ezra cleared his throat. There's something else you should know. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Jed. Found this in the pocket of a drunk border guardian last night. Was going to add it to my collection. Jed unfolded the paper, scanning its contents. It was a partial map of the territory with several locations marked in red, along with a date, November 15th, less than 3 weeks away. What is this? He asked, though he feared he already knew. Coordinated attacks, Ezra replied grimly. They're planning to hit every remaining Apache settlement in the territory on the same day. Call it the final solution to the Apache problem. Nahimana moved beside Jed, looking at the map. Her face remained impassive, but he saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them together. This cannot happen, she said simply. No, it can't, Jed agreed, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. He'd spent years avoiding involvement, protecting himself from pain by refusing to care. Yet here he was, stepping back into the very kind of conflict he'd sworn to avoid. Ezra watched him with knowing eyes. Thought you'd say that. The Jed Sullivan I knew wouldn't stand by for this, no matter how hard he's tried to convince himself otherwise. The Jed Sullivan you knew died a long time ago, Jed muttered. Did he? Ezra glanced pointedly at Nahimana. Seems to me he's still in there somewhere. Before Jed could respond, Nahimana spoke, her voice quiet but firm. This map, my father's people are marked here. She pointed to a location in the mountains. If warning reaches them, they can prepare or flee. Jed studied the map again, noting the distance to the settlement she indicated. At least 5 days' hard ride, and that was assuming good weather and no trouble along the way. I could try to get word to them, he said slowly, already calculating supplies needed, routes to take. I will go, Nahimana stated, not a request but a declaration. Alone? That's suicide, Jed objected. The border guardians patrol those trails, and even if you reached your people safely, would they listen? You said yourself you have nowhere to go. A shadow passed over Nahimana's face. They will listen. I am daughter of Akule, their shaman. Then why were you being sold like meat in Serpent's Fork? Jed asked, immediately regretting his bluntness. A shadow passed over Nahimana's face. I was taken in raid, many moons ago. My father killed protecting sacred cave where our ancestors' spirits dwell. Her eyes grew distant with memory. I lived 3 winters with white settlers who captured me, learned their tongue, their ways. When I escaped and returned to my people, her voice hardened, fingers unconsciously tracing a small scar at her throat. The new shaman said white man's spirit had entered me, said I brought ghosts that would anger our ancestors. Some wanted me dead, but Running Fox remembered my father's standing. Instead, they performed cleansing ritual and sent me away. Her eyes met his. Exile is small death. Each day you are nothing to those who should know your name. My father was powerful shaman, respected but feared, Nahimana continued, her voice dropping lower. He saw beyond this world. Some elders grew jealous of his influence. When he spoke of prophecy, of man in black, they whispered he invited dark spirits. She traced a pattern in the dirt with a slender finger. After raid, when white soldiers took me, I lived at fort for 2 winters, learned their tongue, their customs. One woman there, healer, showed kindness when others did not. Her jaw tightened. When I finally escaped and returned to my people, they saw changes in me, said my spirit was tainted by white man's knowledge. She gestured to her tall frame. And this, my size, they always feared it, said it was marked that spirits had chosen me for something dangerous, that I carried my father's power but lacked his wisdom to control it. They feared what they did not understand, she concluded, meeting Jed's eyes directly. Easier to send away than to accept what is different. The pain behind her stoic expression was palpable. Jed understood rejection all too well, the ache of being cast out by those you considered family. But they'll listen about this threat? He asked gently. They must, she replied, or they die. Ezra, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. You can't go alone, either of you. But together you might stand a chance, he looked at Jed. You know the trails better than most, and you've still got that military bearing that makes men think twice about crossing you. And what about your evidence, Jed asked. Your senator in Washington? Still working on that, Ezra said. Need more proof of official involvement, something that directly links Maxwell to government authorization. He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. But warning those people, that's something you can do now, something concrete. Jed felt the weight of decision pressing on him. For years, he'd avoided choices that might lead to pain or loss. He'd kept moving, kept his head down, survived by not caring too deeply about anything or anyone. Now, in the space of 24 hours, all that careful isolation was crumbling. He looked at Nahimana, at the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering. He thought of Maxwell and the border guardians, of the bloodshed they planned in the name of progress and civilization. And he thought of his dreams, the native woman calling his name before vanishing in flames. We'll leave tomorrow, he said finally. Take the South Trail through the high country. Less chance of running into patrols that way. Relief flickered across Nahimana's face, quickly replaced by her usual stoic expression. Thank you. Ezra clapped Jed on the shoulder. Knew you'd make the right choice, son. He drained his coffee and moved toward the door. I'll keep digging on my end. If I find anything else useful, I'll try to get word to you. Be careful, Jed warned, if Maxwell catches wind of what you're doing. I've survived worse than Luther Maxwell, Ezra interrupted with a grim smile. Besides, who'd suspect an old blacksmith of sedition? I'm practically invisible. After Ezra departed, Jed began preparations for the journey, checking supplies, cleaning his revolver and rifle, studying his maps of the territory. Nahimana helped silently, her movements efficient despite lingering fatigue. As evening approached, Jed cooked a simple meal of cornmeal mush and dried venison. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in thought. You dream, Nahimana said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Jed looked up, startled. What? In night, you speak words, see things. Her dark eyes held his. Bad dreams. Jed set down his spoon, appetite gone. Yes. About what? He hesitated, unused to discussing his innermost demons. But something about her direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. A woman, he admitted, a native woman on a hill. She calls my name, then disappears in fire. Been having the same dream for years. Nahimana's expression didn't change, but he sensed her interest sharpening. This woman, she looks like me? The question struck uncomfortably close to his own unvoiced thoughts. I don't know, he said carefully. Maybe it's just a dream. Dreams are messages, she said with quiet certainty, from spirits, from ancestors, from parts of ourselves that see clearer than waking eyes. Jed had once believed in such things, in signs and wonders, in a God who spoke through burning bushes and still, small voices. But that faith had died on battlefield after battlefield, as prayers went unanswered and atrocities continued unabated. I don't believe in messages anymore, he said finally. Nahimana studied him for a long moment. Yet you freed me, agreed to warn my people. A hint of something like amusement touched her lips. For man who believes nothing, you act like man who believes much. Before Jed could formulate a response, she rose and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. The conversation was over, at least for now. That night, as Jed lay on his cot listening to Nahimana's steady breathing from her place by the stove, he turned her words over in his mind. For a man who believes nothing, you act like man who believes much. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some ember of faith still glowed within him, buried beneath years of cynicism and self-protection. Not faith in God necessarily, but in something, in the possibility that his actions might matter, that one life saved could make a difference in a world determined to destroy itself. It was a dangerous thought, one that could lead to pain and disappointment. Yet as sleep claimed him, Jed found himself hoping, for the first time in years, that his dreams might bring something other than fire and loss. Instead, they brought Nahimana, standing on the same familiar hill. But this time, when she called his name, he didn't turn away. He walked toward her, up the slope, feet heavy as lead. When he reached her, she took his hand and pointed to the horizon, where storm clouds gathered, dark and ominous. It comes, she said, the cleansing fire. Jed woke with a start, heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow from the banked stove. Nahimana slept peacefully, untroubled by prophetic visions. Shaking off the dream's lingering unease, Jed rose quietly and moved to the window. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars scattered like salt across a black tablecloth. No fire, no storm, just the quiet beauty of a world asleep. Yet as he gazed at the heavens, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous approached. Something that would test whatever faith remained in his weary soul. What do you want from me? He whispered to the stars, to the God he no longer believed heard him. Why now? Why her? No answer came. None ever did. But as dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with delicate fingers of light, Jed made peace with his decision. Whatever came next, he would face it alongside this strange, proud woman who had walked into his life like a character from his dreams. Together, they would try to prevent a massacre. Whether they succeeded or failed, at least he would know he had finally stopped watching and started acting. It wasn't redemption. Jed doubted such a thing existed for men like him. But it was something, a step away from the hollow man he'd become. As the first rays of sun touched the cabin, Jed began preparing for the journey ahead. There would be dangers, from nature, from men like Maxwell, perhaps even from the very people they sought to warn. But for the first time in years, Jed Sullivan felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, just possibly, the beginning of a path back to the man he'd once been, before war and loss had stripped him of everything but survival. Nahimana woke as he was packing supplies into saddlebags. She watched him silently for a moment, then rose and began folding her blanket with precise movements. We leave today, she said, not a question, but a confirmation. At first light, Jed replied, long journey ahead. She nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the growing daylight. Good. As they worked together preparing for the trip, Jed couldn't help but notice how their movements fell into natural rhythm, as if they'd been traveling companions for years rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. It was an odd feeling, this unexpected harmony with another person after so long alone. Perhaps it wasn't chance that had brought them together after all. Perhaps it was something older and wiser than either of them could comprehend. Not that Jed would admit such thoughts aloud, but as they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, packs loaded and journey before them, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, the God he'd thought abandoned him had been working in ways too mysterious to recognize until now. The high country stretched before them, rugged and beautiful in its desolation. By midday, they had left the sparse settlements behind, following game trails that wound through stands of juniper and pinyon pine. Jed led the way, Saul plodding steadily behind him, laden with supplies. Nahimana moved with quiet grace beside the mule, her steps sure despite the rough terrain. They spoke little as they traveled, saving breath for the climb. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the creak of leather, the mule's occasional snort, and the whisper of wind through the trees. Jed found himself appreciating Nahimana's stoic endurance. No complaints, no unnecessary words, just steady progress toward their goal. By late afternoon, clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising weather. Jed studied the darkening sky, calculating distances and risks. "Storm coming," he said, breaking the long silence. "We'll need shelter before nightfall." Nahimana nodded, her eyes scanning the landscape ahead. "There," she said, pointing to a rocky outcropping about a half-mile distant. "Cave in those rocks. Good shelter." Jed raised an eyebrow, impressed by her knowledge of the territory. "You've been this way before?" "Many times before." She trailed off, a shadow crossing her features. "Before capture." They reached the cave just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. It wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet deep and 8 feet high at its tallest point. But it was dry and defensible, with a natural stone ledge near the entrance that could serve as a windbreak. Jed unsaddled Saul and secured him in a sheltered spot near the cave mouth, while Nahimana gathered firewood from the surrounding area. By the time the rain began in earnest, they had a small fire going and their gear arranged inside the cave. The storm intensified as darkness fell, wind driving sheets of cold rain against the rocks. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, thunder rolling across the mountains like the drums of war. Inside their stone shelter, Jed and Nahimana sat close to the fire, its warm glow creating an island of light in the surrounding darkness. Jed unwrapped a package of jerky and hardtack, offering a share to Nahimana. She accepted with a nod of thanks, eating methodically, conserving each morsel as one accustomed to scarcity. "Your people," Jed said as they ate, "will they listen to your warning, even though they sent you away?" Nahimana stared into the flames, her profile sharp and proud in the firelight. "They must listen. Death comes otherwise." "But will they?" Jed pressed gently. She turned to face him, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I am daughter of Akule." His words carried weight, even after death. "If I speak them, they will hear." "What words?" "The prophecy." She said it simply, as if it explained everything. Jed waited, sensing there was more she needed to say, giving her space to find the words in her own time. After a long moment, Nahimana continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality, as if reciting something memorized long ago. "My father saw visions, last vision before death. The man in black will burn the world and rebuild it from ashes." "The man in black?" Jed echoed, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Many thought it meant destruction of our people by black-robed priests," Nahimana explained. "By men like you once were." Jed's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where the small cross he'd once worn as a chaplain would have rested. "I never wished destruction on your people. But others did, do still." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "Maxwell, he is man in black, yes?" "He was a chaplain, like me," Jed admitted. "But I never shared his zeal." "Yet you wore same cloth, spoke same words." There was no accusation in her tone, merely observation. Jed looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes, I did." Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave in stark white light. In that brief frozen moment, Jed saw Nahimana not as she appeared now, but as the woman from his dreams. Imperious, knowing, a figure of destiny rather than mere flesh and blood. Then darkness returned, leaving only the fire's steady glow. Jed shook his head, disturbed by the vision and its implications. "What troubles you?" Nahimana asked, noticing his discomfort. Jed hesitated, then decided on honesty. "For a moment you looked like the woman from my dreams." Nahimana nodded slowly, as if his words confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Dreams are doorways. Sometimes we walk through them before we know we've traveled." "What does that mean?" Jed asked, genuinely curious despite his skepticism. "It means our meeting was written in stars long ago," she replied. "Your dreams were preparing your spirit for this journey." Such talk would have earned his dismissal a week ago. Mystical nonsense, the kind of superstition he'd abandoned along with his faith. Yet now, sitting in a cave with the storm raging outside and this enigmatic woman beside him, Jed found himself wanting to believe in something larger than coincidence. "If that's true," he said carefully, "then what happens next? Where does this journey lead?" "I do not know." Nahimana's gaze returned to the fire. "My father saw only pieces. The man in black, the burning world, the rebuilding, the rest." She spread her hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "The rest we write with our choices." They fell silent, each lost in private thoughts as the storm continued its assault on the mountains. Eventually, Nahimana spread her blanket near the fire and lay down, her back to the cave wall, eyes closing in apparent sleep, though Jed suspected she remained alert to any danger. Jed stayed awake longer, feeding small stoics into the fire and listening to the storm's gradual retreat. His mind kept returning to Nahimana's words about dreams and destiny, about prophecies and men in black. He'd worn the collar and preached the word once, believing with all his heart in a divine plan that encompassed every soul. Then the war had happened, and he'd seen too much cruelty, too much senseless suffering to maintain that faith. God, if he existed, had either abandoned his creation or never cared for it in the first place. Yet here was Nahimana, speaking of visions and prophecies as naturally as she breathed, seeing meaning where Jed had long since stopped looking for it. "You think too loud," came her voice from the darkness, startling him. Jed smiled despite himself. "Thought you were asleep. Half sleep, like Fox." She sat up, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Your thoughts, they trouble the air." "Just wondering about prophecies," Jed admitted, "about whether anything is truly written in the stars." Nahimana studied him in the firelight. "You lost faith in your God, in your path." It wasn't a question, but Jed answered anyway. "Yes, a long time ago." "Why?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people danced around the subject of his abandoned calling, too uncomfortable to ask outright why a man of God would forsake his vows. "I saw too much that couldn't be reconciled with the loving God," he said finally. "Too much suffering, too much evil permitted, encouraged even, by those claiming to speak for him." "Like Maxwell." "Like Maxwell," Jed agreed. "But others too, myself included." Nahimana's gaze sharpened. "What did you do that makes you carry such weight?" The question cut to the heart of the guilt Jed had carried for years. No one had asked him so directly before, and he found himself wanting to answer with equal directness. "I failed to protect those who needed protection," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "My wife, my daughter, they were traveling west to join me at my posting. Their wagon train was attacked. I wasn't there." Nahimana's expression softened slightly. "You could not prevent this." "Maybe not." Jed's voice roughened with old grief. "But I could have been with them. Could have died with them, at least. Instead, I was preaching to soldiers about a God of mercy while my family was slaughtered." "This is why you stopped believing? Because your God did not save them?" "Partly." Jed poked the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. "But also because, afterward, I couldn't preach anymore. Couldn't find the words to comfort others when I had none for myself. My superiors, men like Maxwell, said I lacked faith, that I should accept God's will and continue my ministry." His mouth twisted in a bitter smile, as if faith meant never questioning, never doubting, even when the world burns around you. "Faith without questions is not faith," Nahimana said quietly. "It is blindness." Jed looked up, surprised by her insight. "That's not what most Christians would say." I do not know Christian ways, she replied with a small shrug. I know only that questions are how we find truth, how we grow strong in spirit. They fell silent again, but it was a different quality of silence now. Thoughtful rather than wary, a shared contemplation rather than two people merely occupying the same space. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gentle patter of raindrops from tree branches. The moon emerged from behind dissipating clouds, casting silver light across the landscape. Try to sleep, Nahimana said eventually. Journey is long tomorrow. Jed nodded, stretching out beside the fire and pulling his own blanket over him. Good night, Nahimana. Good night, Jedediah Sullivan. The way she said his full name with gravity and something like respect stirred an emotion Jed couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until he was drifting towards sleep that he recognized it. Belonging. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to another human being, a tenuous thread of understanding bridging the vast differences between them. It was a dangerous feeling, one that could lead to attachment and the inevitable pain of loss. Yet as sleep claimed him, Jed found himself unwilling to sever that fragile connection. They rose before dawn, eating a cold breakfast of jerky and dried fruit before continuing their journey. The storm had cleared the air, leaving behind a crystal clarity that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Their path took them higher into the foothills, through stands of ponderosa pine whose resinous scent filled the morning air. By midday, they'd reached a narrow pass between two peaks. Jed called a halt, tethering Saul to a stunted pine while he and Nahimana climbed to a vantage point overlooking the trail ahead. The view was breathtaking, miles of rugged terrain stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of ochre, umber, and sage. But it wasn't the natural beauty that held Jed's attention. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles ahead, a plume of dust rose from the trail, marking the passage of riders. Trouble? Nahimana asked, following his gaze. Could be traders. Could be border guardians. Jed squinted, trying to make out details. 4 riders, moving fast, headed this way. Nahimana's expression hardened. What do we do? Jed considered their options. The pass they were in offered few places to hide. It was essentially a natural funnel between the mountains. Going back would cost precious time they couldn't afford to lose. We keep going, he decided, but carefully. If it's the Guardians, we don't want a confrontation if we can avoid it. They descended to where Saul waited, continuing along the trail, but more cautiously now, alert for any sign of the approaching riders. Jed kept his rifle ready, hoping he wouldn't need to use it, but prepared if the situation demanded. The sound reached them first, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, growing louder by the minute. Jed motioned for Nahimana to move off the trail, guiding Saul behind a cluster of boulders that offered some concealment. Stay here, he whispered. Let me do the talking if they spot us. The riders came into view around a bend in the trail, 4 men on horseback riding hard. Even from a distance, Jed recognized the distinctive hats and bandanas of the border guardians, their rifles gleaming in the sunlight. Down, he hissed, pulling Nahimana deeper into the shadow of the boulders. They crouched together, barely breathing, as the guardians thundered past. For a moment, Jed thought they'd remain undetected. Then one of the riders shouted, pointing toward their hiding place. The group reined in, wheeling their mounts around to face the boulders. Come out with your hands where we can see them, called the lead rider, a stocky man with a bushy mustache. We know you're there. Jed exchanged a glance with Nahimana, who had gone still as stone, her eyes alert for any opportunity. He gave a small shake of his head, not yet, then stood slowly, hands raised to shoulder height. Just a traveler, he called back. No quarrel with you, gentlemen. The 4 guardians approached cautiously, rifles trained on Jed. As they drew nearer, the leader's eyes narrowed in recognition. Well, well, Jedediah Sullivan, his mouth curved in an unpleasant smile. Heard you'd turned native lover. Jed kept his expression neutral. Just passing through, Jenkins, on my way to Fort Courage with supplies. Jenkins snorted. Sure you are. Alone? Would I be talking to you if I wasn't? Jed countered, hoping to draw attention away from the boulders where Nahimana remained hidden. Jenkins dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. Let's have a look at those supplies then. Make sure you're not running guns to the hostiles. No guns, Jed said. Just the usual. Flour, coffee, medicines for the fort. Jenkins approached, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Won't mind if we check then, will you? Jed shrugged, maintaining his casual demeanor while his mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. If they searched behind the boulders, they'd find Nahimana. If that happened, actually, I do mind, he said, letting steel enter his voice. I'm on a schedule, and my business isn't yours. Jenkins' eyes hardened. Everything in this territory is our business now, Sullivan. Governor's orders, so step aside. Jed didn't move. Show me those orders. Don't need to show you a damn thing, Jenkins snarled, drawing his revolver. Now step aside before... His words cut off abruptly as a stone struck him squarely in the temple, sending him staggering. Before the other guardians could react, Nahimana emerged from behind the boulders, a second stone already in her hand. Apache, one of the men shouted, raising his rifle. Jed drew his revolver in one smooth motion, firing a warning shot that kicked up dust at the man's feet. Next one's not a warning. For a tense moment, the tableau held. Jed with his revolver aimed at the mounted guardians, Nahimana poised to throw another stone, Jenkins recovering his balance with murder in his eyes. You're making a mistake, Sullivan, Jenkins growled, blood trickling from the gash on his temple. Maxwell's gonna hear about this. Let him, Jed replied evenly. Now mount up and ride on. We've got no quarrel unless you start one. The three mounted guardians exchanged uncertain glances. None seemed eager to test Jed's marksmanship or risk escalating the situation. Come on, Jenkins, one of them called. We've got patrols to run. Leave these fools be. Jenkins hesitated, rage battling prudence in his expression. Finally, prudence won. He holstered his revolver and remounted his horse, but not before fixing Jed with a hate-filled stare. This isn't over, Sullivan. The territory's changing. No place for Injun lovers anymore. Ride on, Jed repeated, his aim never wavering. With a final venomous glance, Jenkins spurred his horse forward, leading his companions down the trail. Jed kept his revolver trained on their retreating backs until they disappeared around a bend in the canyon. Only then did he lower his weapon, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Beside him, Nahimana relaxed her throwing arm, letting the stone fall from her fingers. They will return, she said, not a question, but a certainty. Not right away, Jed replied, holstering his revolver, but they'll report to Maxwell. We need to move faster now. They continued their journey with renewed urgency, pushing themselves and Saul to maintain a pace that ate up miles despite the difficult terrain. By evening, they'd left the pass behind, descending into a broad valley where a small river cut through the landscape like a silver ribbon. Jed chose a campsite in a grove of cottonwoods near the water, figuring the trees would help conceal their fire from distant observers. They worked together in wordless efficiency, Jed tending to Saul while Nahimana gathered firewood and kindled a small, nearly smokeless flame. As darkness fell, they shared a meager meal of beans and the last of the jerky. Jed studied his map by firelight, calculating distances and estimating their arrival at the Apache settlement. 2 more days, if we push hard, he said, tracing the route with his finger. Assuming no more delays. Nahimana nodded, her face solemn in the flickering light. Jenkins will tell Maxwell. Maxwell will send more men. Probably, Jed agreed, but we've got a head start, and I know these trails better than most of his men. How do you know this Maxwell? Nahimana asked, her perceptive gaze catching something in Jed's tone. Jed hesitated, old memories surfacing, memories he'd spent years trying to bury. He was my superior during the war, a chaplain like me, but different. Different how? He believed God had chosen white Americans to rule this continent, that it was divine will for natives to be conquered or eliminated. Jed's mouth twisted. He found Bible verses to support his view, twisted them to justify atrocities. And you believe this too? No, Jed said firmly. Never that, but I didn't speak against him as strongly as I should have. I told myself it wasn't my place to challenge a superior officer, that my duty was to minister to the men under my care, not to engage in theological disputes. He stared into the fire, shame burning in his chest. I was a coward. Yet now you risk life to warn my people, Nahimana observed. This is not coward's action. Jed looked up, meeting her steady gaze. Maybe I'm trying to balance the scales. Too little, too late. No scales, she said simply. Only now, only choice made today. Her words eased something in Jed's heart, a knot of guilt he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his natural state. The idea that redemption might be found not in grand gestures or divine forgiveness, but in simple, present choices. It was both liberating and terrifying. Your father, he said, changing the subject, the shaman, what was he like? A rare smile touched Nahimana's lips, transforming her severe features into something softer, more vulnerable. Akule was like wind, everywhere and nowhere. He saw what others could not see, knew what others could not know. Her voice took on a reverent quality. He taught me to listen to stones, to speak with eagles, to read signs in water and fire. And the prophecy about the man in black? The smile faded. His last vision. 3 days before raiders came, he called me to his lodge, told me I must remember every word. Her eyes grew distant with the memory. The man in black will burn the world and rebuild it from ashes. I asked what it meant. He said, you will know when time comes. And do you know what it means? Jed asked. Nahimana's gaze returned to him, searching his face as if looking for something hidden beneath his features. I thought it meant destruction of our people. Now, she trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Now what? Jed prompted gently. Now I wonder if man in black is you. The statement hung between them, neither accusation nor compliment, simply an observation that sent a shiver down Jed's spine. He'd worn black as a chaplain, had watched his world burn when his family was killed. And now, perhaps, he was engaged in an act of rebuilding, though what exactly he was rebuilding, he couldn't say. I'm no prophet or savior, he said finally, just a man trying to do one right thing after too many wrong ones. Perhaps that is enough, Nahimana replied. Perhaps that is exactly what prophecy means. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence. Jed added more wood to the fire, watching the flames leap and dance in the gathering darkness. Overhead, stars emerged one by one, cold and distant, yet somehow comforting in their eternal presence. Your wife, Nahimana said after a while, her voice gentle. What was her name? The question caught Jed off guard. He rarely spoke of Sarah, finding the pain too raw even after all these years. Yet now, sitting beside this quiet, perceptive woman who had suffered her own profound losses, he found himself wanting to share the memory. Sarah, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long unspoken. Her name was Sarah. Our daughter was Mary, just 5 years old when he swallowed hard. They were traveling to join me at Fort Gibson. Apache raiders attacked the wagon train. Nahimana's eyes widened slightly. Apache, you are sure? That's what the report said. Jed frowned, noting her reaction. Why? Apache do not attack women, children, she said firmly. Not our way. We fight soldiers, men who threaten our land, but not innocents. Jed had never questioned the official account of the attack. It had been presented as fact. Apache raiders, no survivors, a tragedy, but not an uncommon one in the territories. Could they have been wrong, the reports? He asked slowly. Or lies, Nahimana suggested, to hide truth. A cold feeling settled in Jed's stomach as he considered the possibility. The attack had occurred in Maxwell's jurisdiction. Maxwell, who had always been eager to paint all natives as bloodthirsty savages, who had advocated for harsh retribution against tribes regardless of whether they'd committed any hostilities. Maxwell was stationed nearby, Jed said, thinking aloud. He was the one who identified the attackers as Apache, the one who, he faltered as realization dawned, the one who told me there were no survivors, that Sarah and Mary died quickly. You never saw bodies? Nahimana asked, her voice gentle but persistent. No, they said it was too, that it would be better if I remembered them as they were. Jed's mind raced, reassessing memories he'd buried beneath years of grief and guilt. I believed them. I never questioned. Maxwell lies, Nahimana said simply, about many things. Why not this? The implications were staggering. If Maxwell had lied about the identity of the attackers, what else might he have lied about? Could Sarah and Mary have survived? No, that was too much to hope. Even if the attackers weren't Apache, The wagon train had been destroyed. All passengers declared dead. Yet a seed of doubt had been planted, and Jed found it taking root in soil long barren of hope. I need to know the truth, he said, more to himself than to Nahimana. After all this time, I need to know what really happened. Truth often hides in darkness, Nahimana replied, but it waits for those brave enough to seek it. They fell silent again, each absorbed in private thoughts as the fire burned low and night deepened around them. Eventually, Nahimana spread her blanket near the fire and lay down, though Jed noticed she positioned herself to keep both him and the surrounding darkness in her field of vision. Trust, it seemed, was still a fragile thing between them. Jed took the first watch, sitting with his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees. His mind turned over the possibility that everything he'd believed about his family's death might be built on lies. The thought was both tantalizing and terrifying, offering a glimpse of a truth he'd never sought because the pain of loss had been too overwhelming to bear questioning. If Maxwell had lied about the identity of the attackers, his reasons would have been calculated to further his own agenda, stoking hatred against the Apache, justifying military action against them. But could he have lied about survivors as well? To what end? The questions circled in Jed's mind like predators, offering no answers but gnawing at the foundations of his grief. Eventually, he roused Nahimana for the second watch, stretching out on his blanket with his pistol near his hand. "Wake me at first light," he instructed, already feeling sleep pulling at him after the long day's exertions. "I will," she promised, settling into the watchman's position he'd vacated. As consciousness faded, Jed found himself hoping for dreams. Not the old nightmare of fire and loss, but perhaps some new vision that might offer guidance in this increasingly complex journey. Instead, his sleep was deep and dreamless, a merciful oblivion that lasted until Nahimana's touch on his shoulder brought him back to wakefulness. "Dawn comes," she said softly. "No trouble in night." Jed sat up, immediately alert as years of survival in dangerous territory had trained him to be. The eastern sky showed the first pale streaks of daylight, stars still visible overhead. The air was cold and still, heavy with dew. They broke camp quickly and efficiently, sharing a cold breakfast before continuing their journey. The terrain grew more challenging as they progressed, the trail winding through steep hillsides covered in loose shale that threatened to give way beneath their feet. By midday, they'd reached the edge of a plateau overlooking a vast expanse of territory. Jed called a halt, using the vantage point to scan for any signs of pursuit. The landscape below seemed empty of human presence, just miles of wilderness stretching to the horizon. "How far to your people's settlement?" he asked, passing a water skin to Nahimana. She pointed to a distant line of hills, barely visible through the heat haze. "There, where mountains meet sky. One more day, perhaps two." Jed nodded, calculating distances against their dwindling supplies. They were cutting it close, but barring unforeseen difficulties, they should reach the Apache camp with time to warn them of the impending attack. As they prepared to descend from the plateau, a flash of light in the distance caught Jed's attention, sunlight reflecting off something metallic. He froze, reaching for his spyglass. Through the lens, the distant glint resolved into a grim sight. Riders, at least a dozen, moving purposefully across the landscape below. Even at this distance, Jed recognized the distinctive appearance of the border guardians. "Maxwell's men," he said grimly, passing the spyglass to Nahimana. "They're heading toward the settlement." She looked through the glass, her expression hardening as she confirmed his observation. "They move fast. We'll reach my people before us." "We need to find a faster route," Jed said, unfolding his map. "The main trail follows the valley, but there must be another way." Nahimana studied the terrain, then pointed to a narrow defile cutting through the plateau's edge. "There, Hunter's Path, dangerous but quick, comes out behind the settlement." "How dangerous?" Jed asked, eyeing the steep rocky passage. "Rock falls, narrow places where only one can pass, some climbing." She met his gaze steadily. "But we save half day, maybe more." Jed considered their options. The main trail was safer, but would take too long, especially with Maxwell's men already ahead of them. The Hunter's Path offered speed at the cost of increased risk. "The mule can't manage that," he decided, looking at Saul's sturdy but unagile form. "We'll have to leave him." Nahimana nodded her agreement. Jed quickly redistributed their most essential supplies into 2 packs they could carry, burying the rest in a cache he marked for a potential retrieval later. With a twinge of regret, he removed Saul's pack saddle and turned the animal loose. "Go on, old friend," he said, giving the mule a final pat. "Find your way home." Saul regarded him with doleful eyes before ambling off in search of grazing, apparently untroubled by his sudden freedom. With packs secured and weapons checked, Jed and Nahimana began their descent into the defile. The path, little more than a game trail in places, was as treacherous as Nahimana had warned. It switched back down the face of the plateau, sometimes narrowing to barely a foot's width, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. They moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing their weight. In the narrowest sections, they pressed their backs against the rock face, inching sideways with their heels half off the edge of the trail. Loose stones skittered from beneath their boots, vanishing into the void with hollow, distant impacts that emphasized the consequences of a misstep. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Jed found himself experiencing moments of strange exhilaration. For years, he'd existed in a kind of emotional numbness, going through the motions of survival without truly engaging with life. Now, balancing on the edge of a precipice with every sense heightened, he felt undeniably alive. Nahimana moved ahead of him with the sure-footed grace of one who had traveled such paths before. Watching her navigate the treacherous trail, Jed was struck again by her remarkable resilience. A woman who had lost her father, been rejected by her people, captured and nearly sold as meat, yet who still moved through the world with dignity and purpose. By late afternoon, they descended to a narrow canyon that wound between towering walls of striated stone. The air was cooler here, sheltered from the direct sun, and a small stream trickled along the canyon floor, providing welcome refreshment. They paused briefly to rest and drink, the silence between them comfortable now, built on shared exertion and mutual respect. Jed found himself studying Nahimana's profile as she gazed up at the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. The proud line of her jaw, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the strength evident in every line of her body. She caught him watching and met his gaze without embarrassment or artifice. Something passed between them in that moment, not quite understanding, not quite attraction, but a recognition of kinship that transcended their obvious differences. "We should continue," she said after a moment, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. "Still far to go before dark." Jed nodded, shouldering his pack and falling into step beside her, as they followed the canyon's winding course. The walls gradually lowered as they progressed, the space widening until they emerged into a broad, grass-covered valley dotted with juniper and pinyon. The sun hung low on the horizon now, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the distance, smoke rose from what appeared to be a small settlement, thin vertical columns that spoke of cooking fires rather than destruction. "My people," Nahimana said, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her features. Longing, apprehension, determination. "We made it ahead of Maxwell's men," Jed observed, relief evident in his voice. "Yes," Nahimana squared her shoulders. "Now comes harder part, making them believe." They approached the Apache settlement as twilight deepened into dusk. Jed hung back slightly, allowing Nahimana to lead, acutely aware of how his presence, a white man armed, might be perceived. The settlement consisted of perhaps 24 wickiups arranged in a rough circle, with a larger structure at its center that Jed guessed was a communal or ceremonial space. Cooking fires burned before several dwellings, their smoke carrying the savory scent of roasting meat. Their approach did not go unnoticed. Children playing at the settlement's edge spotted them first, calling out in alarm. Within moments, warriors emerged from the wickiups, bows and rifles at the ready. Nahimana stopped a respectful distance away, raising her empty hands to show she carried no weapons. Jed followed suit, though the weight of his revolver at his hip and the rifle slung across his back felt reassuring in the face of so many hostile stares. An older man stepped forward from the group of warriors, tall and straight-backed despite his years, with long gray hair and a face deeply lined by sun and experience. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache garments and items clearly acquired from white traders, a cotton shirt beneath a deerskin vest decorated with intricate beadwork. "Nahimana," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes wary. "You returned to us." I come with warning, Chief Running Fox, she replied in English, presumably for Jed's benefit. And with truth. The chief's gaze shifted to Jed, assessing him with the practiced eye of one who had encountered many white men and trusted few of them. Who is this you bring among us? Jedediah Sullivan, Nehemiah answered before Jed could speak. He freed me from chains, brings news of great danger to our people. Murmurs ran through the gathering crowd as more of the Apache emerged from their dwellings, drawn by the unusual arrival. Jed could feel their scrutiny, sense the mixture of curiosity and hostility directed toward him. Running Fox studied Jed for a long moment before speaking again. Why would a white man warn Apache of danger? Your kind brings danger. You do not prevent it. It was a fair question, one Jed had been asking himself throughout their journey. Why had he involved himself in this situation? Was it truly altruism or merely an attempt to ease his own conscience? I've seen too much injustice, he said finally, meeting the chief's steady gaze. Done too much watching without acting. This time I choose to act. Running Fox's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Not quite belief, but perhaps willingness to listen. He gestured toward the central structure. Come, we will hear your warning in council. Jed and Nahimana followed the chief toward the large wickiup, the crowd parting before them with reluctance. As they walked, Jed noticed how differently the Apache regarded his companion. Not with hostility, but with a wary respect tinged with superstition. They kept their distance, as if Nahimana carried some contagion they feared catching. Inside the council lodge, several older men and women were already seated in a circle around a small central fire. They watched in silence as Running Fox entered, followed by Nahimana and Jed. The chief took his place in the circle, gesturing for the newcomers to sit opposite him. Jed lowered himself to the ground, crossing his legs and resting his hands on his knees in what he hoped was a respectful posture. Nahimana sat beside him, her back straight, chin lifted with quiet dignity. Running Fox addressed the council in Apache, presumably explaining the situation. Jed watched the faces of the elders as they listened, noting how their gazes kept returning to Nahimana with expressions ranging from suspicion to what appeared to be fear. Finally, Running Fox turned back to them, switching to English. Tell us of this danger you claim approaches. Nahimana looked to Jed, deferring to his greater knowledge of Maxwell's plans. Jed cleared his throat, aware that what he said next could determine whether these people lived or died. A militia group called the Border Guardians plans to attack your settlement, he began, keeping his voice steady and direct. They're led by a man named Luther Maxwell, a former military chaplain who believes it's God's will to eliminate all Apache from this territory. He went on to describe what they knew, the coordinated attacks planned for November 15th, the governmental support Maxwell had secured, the fact that other Apache settlements throughout the territory were similarly targeted. They have superior weapons, Jed concluded, and they'll show no mercy. Women, children, they'll kill everyone they find. As he spoke, he watched the faces of the council members. Some showed alarm, others skepticism, a few remained unreadable. Running Fox listened without interruption, his weathered features giving no hint of his thoughts. When Jed finished, the chief looked to Nahimana. And you, daughter of Akule, why do you bring this warning to people who sent you away? Her response was simple but powerful. Because death does not ask if one belongs before it takes. A murmur ran through the council at her words. Running Fox studied her for a long moment before replying. How do we know this is not a trick? That you do not lead these guardians to us with your white companion? It was the question Jed had been dreading, the logical suspicion of a people who had experienced generations of betrayal. Before he could formulate a response, Nahimana spoke. My father's last prophecy, she said, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality Jed had heard when she first mentioned the vision. The man in black will burn the world and rebuild it from ashes. The effect of these words on the council was immediate and dramatic. Elders leaned forward, exchanging glances laden with significance. Running Fox himself seemed momentarily startled before recovering his composure. You speak Akule's words, he acknowledged, but this does not prove your warning true. Maxwell's men are already on their way, Jed interjected, frustration edging his tone. We saw them today, perhaps half a day's ride from here. A dozen or more, well armed. This concrete detail seemed to carry more weight than abstract warnings of future attacks. Running Fox conferred briefly with the other council members in their own language before addressing Jed again. If what you say is true, why come to warn us? What do you gain? The question cut to the heart of Jed's motivations, forcing him to articulate what he'd been avoiding examining too closely. Why had he undertaken this dangerous journey? What did he hope to gain? I gained nothing, he said slowly, except perhaps the knowledge that for once, I didn't stand aside while innocent people were harmed. He met the chief's penetrating sermon. I was a chaplain once, a man of God. I've seen too many atrocities committed in his name. This time I choose a different path. Running Fox considered this, then turned to Nahimana. And you? What do you seek from people who rejected you? I seek nothing, she replied with a quiet dignity. I am daughter of Akule. I carry his words, his wisdom. What you do with them is your choice. A long silence followed as Running Fox weighed their statements. Finally, he rose to his feet, signaling the council's discussion was concluded. We will consider your warning, he announced. Until then, you will remain as our guests. Food and shelter will be provided. It wasn't the immediate call to action Jed had hoped for, but it was better than outright rejection. He and Nahimana followed a young warrior to a small wickiup at the settlement's edge, where they were brought food and water before being left alone. Will they listen? Jed asked once they were private. Will they act in time? Nahimana settled cross-legged on a woven mat, her expression thoughtful. Running Fox is cautious but wise. He will not dismiss warning without consideration. We don't have time for lengthy consideration, Jed pointed out. Maxwell's men could arrive tomorrow. Council must discuss. Warriors must prepare. This is our way. She met his worried gaze. Have faith, Jedediah Sullivan. You have done what you came to do. Jed sighed, the tension of the day catching up with him now that they'd reached their destination. I suppose you're right. The decision is theirs now. They ate the provided meal, a stew of venison and wild vegetables, in companionable silence. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of the settlement continuing. Children playing, women talking, men returning from hunting. Life proceeding as it always had, unaware of the threat approaching from beyond the horizon. As night deepened, Jed found himself wondering what would happen after this immediate crisis passed. Would Nahimana stay with her people, despite their previous rejection? Would he return to his solitary existence, hauling freight across the territory? The thought of returning to that lonely life held little appeal now, yet he struggled to imagine an alternative. Your thoughts are loud again, Nahimana observed, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Jed chuckled softly, just wondering what comes next, after we've delivered our warning. Must comes what must come, she replied simply. Path reveals itself one step at a time. It was a philosophy at odds with Jed's preference for planning and preparation. Yet he found wisdom in it nonetheless. Perhaps there was freedom in accepting that the future couldn't be controlled, only met with courage and integrity. I hope your people will accept you back, he said after a moment. After all this, Nahimana's expression grew distant. They fear what I represent. Akule's daughter, marked by prophecy, touched by white man's world. Not Apache enough, not white enough. Belonging nowhere. The loneliness in her words resonated with Jed's own sense of displacement. He too existed between worlds. No longer a man of faith, yet unable to fully embrace cynicism. No longer military, yet not truly civilian. Connected to humanity, yet apart from it. Perhaps belonging isn't found in a place or a people, he suggested. Perhaps it's a state of being at peace with oneself. Nahimana considered this, then nodded slowly. Wise words, chaplain. Not a chaplain anymore, Jed reminded her gently. Perhaps not in title, she replied. But in heart, this remains to be seen. Before Jed could respond to this observation, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, running feet, the nickering of horses. He was on his feet in an instant, hand going to his revolver as he moved toward the Wikiup's entrance. Stay here, he told Nahimana, though he doubted she would obey if danger threatened. Stepping outside, Jed saw warriors gathering near the settlement's perimeter. Weapons ready, Running Fox stood among them, issuing orders in rapid-fire Apache. Beyond the circle of wiki-ups, torches bobbed in the darkness, approaching riders. Maxwell's men, Jed muttered, drawing his revolver. They've come sooner than expected. Nahimana appeared beside him, a knife she'd acquired somewhere gleaming in her hand. We fight? Before Jed could answer, Running Fox approached them, his expression grim. Border Guardians come. Small group, but more will follow. Let me talk to them, Jed offered. I know their leader. Maybe I can buy you time to prepare or evacuate. The chief studied him for a moment, then nodded sharply. We will be ready if words fail. Jed moved toward the settlement's edge, Nahimana falling into step beside him despite his earlier instruction to stay behind. As they approached the perimeter, the torchlight revealed 5 riders approaching at a measured pace, not charging in for an attack, but advancing with deliberate caution. Jed's heart sank as he recognized the lead rider's silhouette. Even after all these years, he would know that rigid posture, that particular way of sitting a horse as if judging the animal beneath him. Luther Maxwell had arrived. Luther Maxwell cut an imposing figure in the torchlight. At 55, he remained straight-backed and broad-shouldered, his beard now more gray than black, but his eyes still burning with the same zealous intensity Jed remembered from their days in the military. He wore a black coat despite the warm evening, a silver cross gleaming at his throat. Beside him rode 4 border guardians, hands resting near their weapons, expressions vigilant as they surveyed the Apache settlement. They halted their horses about 50 yards from where Jed and Nahimana stood, close enough for conversation, but maintaining a tactical distance. Maxwell's gaze fixed on Jed, surprise briefly flickering across his features before being replaced by a thin smile. Jedediah Sullivan, he called, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. I'd heard rumors you were in these parts, but I scarcely believed them. His eyes shifted to Nahimana, and with such interesting company. Maxwell, Jed acknowledged, keeping his tone neutral despite the tension coiling inside him. You're a long way from a proper military post. The Lord's work takes me where I'm needed, Maxwell replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. And it seems his hand guided me here tonight, where I find an old colleague consorting with heathens. Behind them, Jed could sense the Apache warriors moving into position, bows drawn and rifles ready. Running Fox stood a few paces back, observing the exchange but allowing Jed to speak. What do you want here? Jed asked, though he already knew the answer. Maxwell's smile faded. I think you know, Chaplain. These savages have plagued honest settlers for too long. The territory is changing. There's no place for their kind in the new order. They've done nothing to harm you or anyone else, Jed countered. They live peacefully, apart from settlements. Apart today, raiding tomorrow, Maxwell said dismissively. You've gone soft, Sullivan. Forgotten what these creatures did to your own family. The words struck like a physical blow. Jed felt Nahimana tense beside him, her hand brushing his arm in silent warning or support. What exactly did they do to my family, Maxwell? Jed asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Was it Apache who attacked that wagon train? Or was that a convenient lie? Something flickered across Maxwell's face, surprise perhaps, or calculation. I see your Apache witch has been filling your head with falsehoods. Answer the question. Jed's hand hovered near his revolver. Was it Apache? Maxwell straightened in his saddle, his expression hardening. What does it matter who pulled the trigger? All savages are cut from the same cloth. Your family died because of the native problem, and I'm here to ensure no more innocent blood is spilled. By spilling innocent blood yourself, Jed said bitterly. There are no innocents among them, Maxwell replied, his tone taking on the cadence Jed remembered from his sermons. The Lord commands us in Numbers 33:52. Drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places. You always were selective in your scripture, Jed said, disgust rising in his throat. What about thou shalt not kill? What about mercy and justice? Maxwell's expression darkened. I didn't come here to debate theology with an apostate. I came with a message. He raised his voice, clearly intending it to carry to the assembled Apache. You have until dawn tomorrow to leave this place. Any who remain will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. And if they refuse to be driven from their home, Jed challenged, then their blood is on their own heads. Maxwell's eyes glittered in the torchlight. And on yours, Sullivan, for encouraging their defiance. Jed felt the weight of the moment pressing upon him. Behind him stood people who had done nothing to deserve the fate Maxwell planned for them. Before him sat a man he'd once respected, now corrupted by hatred dressed as righteousness. There are more of us than you see, Jed said, gesturing toward the darkness surrounding the settlement. You'd be wise to reconsider this course. Maxwell laughed, the sound devoid of humor. A bluff, Chaplain? How disappointing. He glanced at the Apache warriors visible at the settlement's edge. I count perhaps 20 fighters. I have 5 men with me now and 30 more who will arrive by dawn. The odds do not favor your new friends. Leave, Maxwell, Jed said, steel entering his voice. There's been enough bloodshed in this territory. Indeed there has, Maxwell agreed, his tone suddenly cold, and there will be more before this land is cleansed. He gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse. Dawn, Sullivan, convince them to go, or prepare to meet your maker alongside them. With that, he wheeled his mount around, his men following suit. They rode back into the darkness, torches bobbing until they disappeared over a rise. Jed released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hand falling away from his revolver. Beside him, Nahimana remained tense, her eyes fixed on the spot where Maxwell had vanished. He lies about numbers, she said quietly. More than 5, fewer than 30. Probably, Jed agreed, but enough to cause significant harm. Running Fox approached them, his weathered face solemn in the dim light from the settlement's fires. You know this man well, he observed. I served with him during the war, Jed confirmed. He's dangerous, believes absolutely in his cause, and he has support from officials who want this land cleared for settlement. The chief nodded thoughtfully. You said we had until November 15th. Now he says dawn. He must have accelerated his plans when he learned we were warning the settlements, Jed reasoned, but his full force likely isn't assembled yet. That's why he's giving you until dawn. He's waiting for reinforcements. Running Fox considered this information, then spoke a few rapid sentences in Apache to the warriors gathered nearby. They dispersed immediately, moving with purpose toward different parts of the settlement. We prepare, the chief explained simply. For fight or flight. Which will you choose, Jed asked. Running Fox's eyes held ancient wisdom and weariness. This is sacred land. Our ancestors rest here. The spirits of our people dwell in these mountains and valleys. He gazed around at the settlement, the homes, the families, the life his people had built. But land without people means nothing. People without land can find new home. You'll evacuate, Jed surmised. Most will go, Running Fox confirmed. Women, children, elders. Some warriors will stay, delay Maxwell's men, give others time to reach safety. It was a practical decision, one that prioritized survival over pride. Jed respected it, even as he recognized the profound loss it represented for these people. Where will they go, he asked. North, to mountains where other bands camp for winter. Running Fox glanced at Nahimana. Daughter of Akule will guide them. Her father's name still carries weight among northern bands. Nahimana appeared startled by this statement. You wish me to lead our people? You brought warning, the chief said simply. You remembered your father's words when others forgot. This is redemption. The word hung between them, laden with significance. Nahimana's expression remained stoic, but Jed saw the subtle straightening of her shoulders. The flash of emotion quickly controlled. I will lead them, she agreed, her voice steady despite the weight of responsibility being placed upon her. Running Fox nodded once, then turned to Jed. And you, Chaplain? Will you go with our people or stay with the warriors? It was a question Jed had been asking himself since Maxwell appeared. The practical choice, the survivor's choice, would be to accompany the evacuees to help guide them to safety. But something deeper pulled at him, an obligation he couldn't easily dismiss. I'll stay, he heard himself say. Maxwell is my responsibility, in a way. I stood silent too many times when he twisted faith to justify cruelty. Not this time. The chief studied him with keen eyes that seemed to penetrate Jed's very soul. You seek redemption also. It wasn't a question, and Jed didn't treat it as one. Perhaps, or perhaps just the peace of knowing I finally chose the right side. Running Fox clasped his shoulder briefly, a gesture of respect between warriors. Prepare. We moved before midnight. As the chief walked away to oversee the evacuation preparations, Jed turned to find Nahimana watching him with an unreadable expression. You do not have to stay, she said quietly. This is not your fight. It became my fight when Maxwell made it one, Jed replied. Besides, I know his tactics, his weaknesses. I might be useful here. Nahimana searched his face, her dark eyes reflecting the distant firelight. You truly believe your death will balance scales? I don't plan on dying, Jed said with a faint smile. But if it comes to that, there are worse reasons to meet one's end. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body in the cool night air. I have lost father, home, people. I do not wish to lose you also, Jedediah Sullivan. The simple statement struck Jed with unexpected force. In their short time together, this proud, resilient woman had come to care what became of him, perhaps even as much as he had come to care for her. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. You won't lose me, he promised, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. I've survived worse than Luther Maxwell. Nahimana didn't reply, but her hand found his in the darkness, fingers interlacing briefly before she stepped away. The touch lingered on Jed's skin like a blessing or a benediction. The next hours passed in a flurry of controlled activity. The Apache moved with remarkable efficiency, gathering only essential possessions, breaking down wiki-ups, preparing travois for the elderly and infirm. Children were kept quiet, urged to understand the gravity of the situation without being terrified by it. Jed assisted where he could, helping to distribute supplies and offering his knowledge of the northern routes. Meanwhile, a smaller group of warriors prepared defenses, positioning themselves at strategic points around the settlement, setting traps along likely approach routes, making ready for the delaying action that would give the evacuees time to escape. As midnight approached, the settlement had been transformed. Most structures had been dismantled, the materials either taken for the journey or repurposed for defensive barriers. Only the council lodge and a few smaller wiki-ups remained standing, creating the illusion from a distance that the settlement was still intact. Running Fox gathered everyone for final instructions. The evacuation party, nearly 60 people, including women, children, and several warriors as guards, would leave first, heading northeast through a narrow canyon before turning north toward the mountains. The remaining warriors, 12 in all, including Running Fox himself, would stay behind to create the impression the settlement was still occupied, then engage Maxwell's forces when they attacked at dawn. We need not defeat them, the chief explained to his warriors. Only delay them until our people are beyond reach. Jed listened to the plan, recognizing its tactical soundness while acknowledging its inherent risk. The staying party was essentially sacrificing themselves to ensure the others' escape. It was a noble strategy, but one that would likely end in bloodshed. As the evacuation party prepared to depart, Jed found himself drawn to where Nahimana stood helping a young mother secure her infant in a carrying sling. The domesticity of the scene contrasted sharply with their dire circumstances, highlighting what was truly at stake, not just land or pride, but human lives, families, futures. When Nahimana noticed his approach, she stepped away from the mother with a final reassuring word. Her pack was already secured, a rifle slung across her back alongside a quiver of arrows and a bow. She looked like a warrior, despite her assignment to the evacuation party. It is time, she said simply. Jed nodded, suddenly finding words inadequate. What could he say in what might be their final moments together? Thanks for the brief companionship. Apologies for the failures of his people. Promises he might not live to keep. In the end, he settled for honesty. I'm glad we met, Nahimana, even under these circumstances. A rare smile softened her features. The spirits guided our paths to cross, for purpose. What purpose, do you think, Jed asked. Perhaps to heal what was broken in both of us, she suggested. Perhaps to fulfill my father's prophecy. Perhaps, she hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. Perhaps to show that bridge between our peoples is possible, even in dark times. The thought was both hopeful and heart-wrenching, given the violence that dawn would likely bring. Jed wanted to believe such bridges were possible, that understanding could triumph over hatred. But Maxwell and his border guardians represented a powerful counterargument. If I survive this, Jed said, I'll find you. In the northern camps. When you survive, Nahimana corrected, her tone allowing no possibility of failure. From around her neck, she removed a small leather pouch suspended on a thong and placed it over Jed's head. My father's medicine. Protection. Jed touched the pouch, feeling the small objects inside, stones perhaps, or other sacred items. Thank you. Impulsively, he reached into his shirt and withdrew the small silver cross he still carried despite his lapsed faith, a gift from Sarah on the day of his ordination. He pressed it into Nahimana's palm. My protection for yours, he said softly. She closed her fingers around the cross, then tucked it into the small pouch she wore at her waist. No words were needed to acknowledge the significance of the exchange. Running Fox approached, indicating it was time for the evacuation party to move out. Nahimana nodded, shouldering her pack more securely. Walk in beauty, Jedediah Sullivan, she said using the traditional Apache blessing. And you, Nahimana, he replied, his throat tight with emotions he dared not examine too closely. Until we meet again. With a final look that seemed to memorize his features, she turned and joined the line of people moving silently into the night, her tall figure distinctive, even in the darkness. Jed watched until she disappeared from view, carrying with her a piece of himself he hadn't realized he still possessed to give. Running Fox's hand on his shoulder broke the moment. Come, chaplain, we have work to prepare. The remaining hours until dawn were spent in strategic preparation. The warriors positioned themselves throughout the settlement, some hidden within the remaining structures, others concealed in the surrounding landscape. Jed, with his knowledge of military tactics, helped plan their defense, identifying likely lines of attack, suggesting placements for their limited number of firearms, recommending when to engage and when to fall back. As the eastern sky began to lighten, the 12 defenders gathered in the council lodge for a final council. Running Fox spoke to his warriors in Apache, his words incomprehensible to Jed, but their meaning clear from the solemn nods and resolute expressions they evoked. Then the chief switched to English for Jed's benefit. We fight not for victory today, but for time. Every minute we delay these men is another minute our people move towards safety. He looked around the circle, meeting each man's eyes in turn. It is good to die protecting one's people, but better to live and join them when our task is done. The message was clear: fight hard but retreat when possible. This was not to be a last stand but a delaying action, with survival still the ultimate goal. As they filed out of the lodge, Running Fox held Jed back with a hand on his arm. You do not have to stay, chaplain. This is not your people. It's my fight, Jed replied simply. Maxwell and men like him have twisted faith into a weapon. I can't stand aside anymore. The chief studied him, then nodded once. Perhaps Akule's prophecy speaks of you after all. The man in black who burns the world and rebuilds from ashes. Before Jed could respond to this unsettling suggestion, a warrior called out softly from his position as lookout. Running Fox moved immediately to join him, Jed following close behind. From their vantage point, they could see movement in the pre-dawn light, riders approaching from the southwest, perhaps 24 in all. They moved with military precision, spreading out to encircle the settlement rather than charging directly toward it. Maxwell leads them, Running Fox observed, pointing to a figure in black at the center of the formation. Jed nodded grimly. He's smart, setting up to cut off escape routes before attacking. But our people are already gone, the chief said with quiet satisfaction. His plan fails before it begins. The border guardians halted just beyond rifle range, forming a loose semicircle around the settlement. Through his spyglass, Jed could see Maxwell conferring with his lieutenants, likely discussing their approach. They'll send scouts first, Jed predicted, to test our defenses, count our numbers. Running Fox relayed this information to his warriors in Apache, adjusting their strategy accordingly. They would allow the scouts to penetrate the settlement's outer perimeter, then ambush them, creating the impression of a larger defending force. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Maxwell's forces made their move. Two riders broke from the main group, approaching the settlement cautiously from different angles. The Apache defenders remained hidden, allowing the scouts to enter the perimeter unchallenged. Jed watched from his position behind a partially collapsed wickiup as one scout dismounted, rifle at the ready, moving from structure to structure. The man's confusion was evident. Most dwellings were gone, the settlement largely abandoned. When the scout reached the council lodge, a signal from Running Fox triggered the ambush. Warriors emerged from hiding, arrows flying with deadly accuracy. The scout fell before he could raise his rifle. Simultaneously, gunfire erupted from the other side of the settlement as the second scout met a similar fate. The message to Maxwell was clear. The settlement might be partially abandoned, but it was still defended. The Border Guardians' response was immediate. Rifles cracked as they provided covering fire for a second wave of attackers. 6 men charging forward on horseback, shooting as they came. The Apache returned fire with their limited firearms, forcing the attackers to veer off or dismount for cover. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse. The defenders used their intimate knowledge of the settlement to appear and disappear, striking from unexpected quarters before melting away again. To Maxwell's men, it must have seemed they faced a much larger force, their frustration evident in increasingly erratic gunfire. Jed moved between positions, offering support where needed. He'd taken up his rifle again after years of avoiding violence, finding the old skills returning with disturbing ease. He didn't aim to kill, placing his shots to disable horses or wound attackers when possible. But in the chaos of battle, such distinctions became academic. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher as the skirmish evolved into a prolonged engagement. The Border Guardians gradually tightened their perimeter, pushing the defenders back toward the center of the settlement. Casualties mounted on both sides. 2 Apache warriors dead, several of Maxwell's men wounded or killed. By midday, the situation had deteriorated. The defenders were cornered in and around the council lodge, surrounded on all sides. Their ammunition dwindled, and Maxwell's forces, though reduced, still outnumbered them significantly. Running Fox, bleeding from a bullet graze along his arm, conferred with his remaining warriors. Time to withdraw, he decided. We have given our people hours. Now we save ourselves if possible. They had prepared an escape route, a narrow ravine behind the council lodge that led toward the hills. If they could break through the perimeter at that point, they might reach the rough country where horses couldn't follow. As they prepared for their desperate gambit, gunfire suddenly erupted from beyond the Border Guardians' position, precise shots that sent Maxwell's men diving for cover. What happens? Running Fox demanded. Peering through gaps in the lodge's structure. Jed risked a glance outside, his heart leaping at what he saw. Reinforcements, he said, scarcely believing his eyes. But not for Maxwell. Riders had appeared on the ridge overlooking the settlement, perhaps 10 men, firing with disciplined precision at the Border Guardians. Jed didn't recognize them until a familiar figure rode into view. Ezra Coleman, the old blacksmith from Serpent's Fork, leading what appeared to be a hastily assembled militia. Friends, Jed explained to Running Fox, Ezra has brought help. The unexpected attack from their rear threw the Border Guardians into confusion. Maxwell could be heard shouting orders, trying to reorganize his men to face threats from 2 directions. Running Fox seized the opportunity. Now we go. While they are distracted, the remaining Apache warriors gathered their wounded and prepared to move. Jed, however, found himself hesitating. I need to end this, he said more to himself than to Running Fox. As long as Maxwell lives, he'll continue his campaign. The chief studied him with knowing eyes. You seek him specifically. Yes, Jed checked his revolver, 3 bullets remaining. Get your people to safety. I'll try to reach Ezra's group. Running Fox clasped his arm briefly. May your aim be true, Chaplain. With that, the Apache slipped away, taking advantage of the confusion to make their escape through the ravine. Jed moved in the opposite direction, working his way toward where he had last seen Maxwell directing his men. The battlefield had devolved into chaos. Smoke from burning wickiups obscured visibility, gunfire echoed from multiple directions, and men shouted conflicting orders. Jed used the confusion to his advantage, moving from cover to cover, avoiding direct engagement when possible. He spotted Maxwell near what remained of a defensive barricade, conferring urgently with 2 lieutenants. The former chaplain's black coat was dust-covered now, His face streaked with sweat and grime, but his bearing remained commanding. Jed approached cautiously, revolver ready. He was within 20 yards when one of Maxwell's men spotted him, shouting a warning. Maxwell turned, eyes widening briefly before narrowing in recognition. "Sullivan," he said, drawing his own weapon, "I should have known you'd be behind this." "It's over, Maxwell," Jed called. "Your men are caught between two forces. Surrender now and prevent more bloodshed." Maxwell laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. "Surrender to heathens and traitors?" His eyes gleamed with the same zealous light Jed remembered from war sermons. "This territory is destined for civilization, Sullivan. What happens today means nothing in God's grand design." "Your version of God's design ends here," Jed replied, stepping closer, his revolver trained on Maxwell's chest. "But first, tell me the truth about my family. Was it Apache who attacked that wagon train? Or was that another of your lies?" "Did they?" Jed challenged. "Or was that another of your lies?" Something flickered across Maxwell's face, calculation perhaps, or the recognition that his deception might be unraveling. "What does it matter who pulled the trigger? The point is—" "It matters to me," Jed interrupted, voice hardening. "Tell me the truth, Maxwell. Were it Apache who attacked that wagon train?" For a moment, Jed thought Maxwell would continue to dissemble. Then a new expression crossed the man's features. Not just resigned pride, but something more complex, a flash of old pain quickly masked. "Would you have fought with the same zeal if you'd known it was deserters from our own ranks?" he asked, his tone almost conversational, despite the revolver still pointed at his chest. "Would you have led prayers for men pursuing our righteous cause if you'd known the full scope of what was necessary?" The confirmation hit Jed like a physical blow. His worst suspicions confirmed, he struggled to maintain his aim as rage and grief threatened to overwhelm him. "You let me believe," he began, his voice raw. "All these years, I gave you a purpose," Maxwell countered, "a reason to fight. And when you lost your nerve, when your faith wavered, I gave you a reason to hate yourself instead of our enemies." His mouth twisted in a cruel smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It worked perfectly. "You're insane," Jed said, genuine horror in his voice. Maxwell's expression hardened, but for an instant, Jed glimpsed something beneath the zealot's mask, a hollow grief that mirrored his own. "You think I don't understand loss, Sullivan? My wife and 3 children were killed by raiders in '58, while I was away preaching God's word." His voice dropped lower, vibrating with contained fury. "You weren't the only chaplain to return to graves. The difference between us is that I didn't abandon my faith when tragedy struck. I saw purpose in it." He straightened despite his wounded leg, voice gaining strength. "I'm not insane, I'm a visionary. I see what must be done to secure this land for civilization. Individual sacrifices, even tragic ones, are necessary in war. Someone must have the strength to make those choices, to bear that burden." His eyes burned with the intensity of absolute conviction. "You lost your courage, Sullivan. I found mine." For the briefest moment, Jed saw Maxwell not as a monster, but as a broken man who had rebuilt himself around his pain, turning grief into righteous fury, doubt into unshakable conviction. It made him more human, and somehow more frightening. "This isn't war," Jed replied quietly. "It's genocide, and it ends now." He tightened his finger on the trigger, prepared to end Maxwell's life, to avenge Sarah and Mary, to prevent future atrocities, to cleanse the world of one man's poisonous hatred. In that moment of decision, Nahimana's wisdom returned to him. Taking a life wouldn't restore what was lost. The path forward wasn't through vengeance, but through justice. The choice he made now would define who he truly was, not his past failures. Killing Maxwell wouldn't balance any scales. It wouldn't bring back his family or heal the wounds of the past. It would only add another death to the day's tally, perpetuating the cycle of violence Maxwell himself had championed. Jed lowered his aim slightly, firing a shot that struck Maxwell in the leg rather than the chest. The man collapsed with a cry of pain and surprise. "You'll face justice," Jed told him, moving forward to secure Maxwell's dropped weapon. "Real justice, not your perverted version of it." Before he could reach Maxwell, gunfire erupted from his right. Jed felt a searing pain in his side, staggering as the impact spun him halfway around. One of Maxwell's lieutenants had fired, the man already chambering another round. Jed returned fire instinctively, his shot catching the lieutenant in the shoulder. The man fell back but remained a threat. Clutching his bleeding side, Jed sought cover behind a collapsed wickiup, aware that his position was dangerously exposed. Maxwell, despite his wounded leg, was dragging himself toward his fallen revolver. Jed fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt inches from Maxwell's outstretched hand. The former chaplain froze, glaring up at Jed with undisguised hatred. "It's finished, Maxwell," Jed called, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the pain spreading from his wound. "The Apache are safe. Your mission failed." Maxwell stared at him with something between hatred and pity. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about one settlement or one day. The tide of history can't be turned back by a sentimental fool and a handful of savages." Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his wounded leg. "My work will continue. Others will take up the cause." Jed limped closer, keeping his revolver trained on Maxwell. "Maybe, but today you face justice, not just for the Apache, but for Sarah and Mary, for using their memory as a weapon." His voice dropped lower. "And for all the men whose faith you twisted to serve your crusade." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in Maxwell's eyes, the first doubt Jed had ever seen there, before hatred reasserted itself. "You're a dead man, Sullivan. You just don't know it yet." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Riders appeared through the smoke, Ezra at their head, accompanied by what appeared to be a mix of settlers and miners, an impromptu posse rather than a formal militia. "Jed," Ezra called, dismounting hastily when he spotted his friend. "You're hit." "I'll live," Jed replied, though he wasn't entirely confident of that assessment given the warm blood soaking his shirt. "Maxwell's there. Don't let him get away." Ezra signaled to his companions, who moved to secure Maxwell and his wounded lieutenant. The old blacksmith knelt beside Jed, examining the wound with practiced eyes. "Bullet went clean through," he reported. "Bleeding's not too bad. You might just survive this foolishness after all." "What are you doing here?" Jed asked, allowing Ezra to help him to a sitting position against what remained of a wickiup wall. "How did you know?" "Got word Maxwell was moving early," Ezra explained, tearing a strip from his own shirt to fashion a makeshift bandage. "Figured he'd discovered your warning mission. Gathered what men I could and followed his trail." He secured the bandage around Jed's midsection, drawing a wince of pain. "Seems we arrived just in time." "The Apache?" Jed asked. "Running Fox and his warriors?" "Saw them slipping away through the ravine as we arrived," Ezra confirmed. "Smart old Fox, that one. Knew when to fight and when to run." Relief flooded through Jed at this news. The delaying action had worked. The evacuation party had gained precious hours to distance themselves from danger, and even the rear guard had escaped relatively intact. "What about Maxwell?" he asked, watching as the wounded man was disarmed and restrained by Ezra's posse. "What happens to him now?" Ezra's expression hardened. "That's the best part. Remember I told you I was collecting evidence? Well, I found what I needed." He patted a leather satchel at his side. Orders from the territorial governor authorizing Maxwell to pacify the region, correspondence about land deals that would follow once the Apache were relocated, and accounts of previous massacres disguised as defensive actions. "Evidence of conspiracy," Jed surmised. "Evidence of crimes," Ezra corrected. "Enough to see Maxwell face a territorial court and implicate officials all the way to Santa Fe. My contact in Washington, a young congressman with presidential ambitions, is personally interested in exposing this corruption. He's sending a federal marshal with explicit orders to deliver Maxwell to Fort Leavenworth for a military tribunal." Ezra's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "The governor and 3 territorial judges are already named in these documents. By spring, half the territorial administration will be replaced. It won't end the troubles, but it'll set things back a decade for men like Maxwell." It was more justice than Jed had dared hope for, not merely stopping one attack, but potentially ending the systematic campaign against the Apache throughout the territory. "What happened with Maxwell was no small thing," Ezra continued, his voice dropping lower. "The marshal who came, fellow named James Cooper, He'd been investigating Indian affairs corruption for months. Maxwell's documents gave him the final pieces he needed. Last I heard, 3 territorial officials lost their positions, and the governor himself barely escaped indictment by claiming ignorance. Jed raised an eyebrow. You believe that? That he didn't know? About as much as I believe a rattlesnake doesn't know it's poisonous. Ezra spat. But what matters is the policy changed. That new Indian commissioner from Washington, the one with the Quaker background, he's redirected funds meant for pacification into actual supplies and educational provisions. It won't solve everything, but it's a start, Jed finished for him. A crack in the foundation of a rotten system. Ezra nodded soberly. Maxwell himself got 20 years in federal prison. He'll be an old man if he ever walks free again. His border guardians scattered like cockroaches when the light hit them, some trying to claim they were just following orders, others disappearing across state lines. He paused, a grim satisfaction in his weathered face. The land they were planning to open for settlement after removing the Apache, still in native hands, at least for now. Jed absorbed this information, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Justice had been served, at least in this instance, but he harbored no illusions that the larger struggle was over. As long as there was land to be taken and profit to be made, men like Maxwell would find ways to justify cruelty in the name of progress or divine will. One battle won, he said quietly, in a very long war. Yes, Ezra agreed, but sometimes one battle is all we get. And this one, it mattered. As if reading his thoughts, Ezra added, it won't solve everything. There will be other Maxwells, other schemes to take native land, but it might buy time, change the conversation. Time is all anyone can ask for, Jed said, thinking of Nahimana leading her people toward Northern Sanctuary. Time to find better solutions than violence. As Maxwell was secured to a horse, his final words hung in the smoky air. God's work continues with or without me, Sullivan. Remember that when the savages you saved slaughter innocent settlers, Ezra spat in the dirt. Man twists scripture till it's poison, then wonders why folks die from it. Faith isn't the problem, Jed said quietly, thinking of Nahimana's wisdom. It's what men choose to do with it. His hand touched the medicine pouch at his chest. Maybe there's room for more than one truth in this territory. They fell silent, watching as the impromptu posse prepared to depart, securing prisoners and gathering their dead and wounded. The settlement lay in ruins around them. Wickiups burned or collapsed, the ground littered with spent cartridges and arrows, the air heavy with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Yet amid the destruction, Jed felt a curious sense of peace. Not happiness, the day's violence had extracted too high a cost for that, but a settling of accounts within his soul. He had finally faced Maxwell, learned the truth about his family's death, and chosen justice over vengeance. More importantly, he had acted rather than stood aside, had used his knowledge and skills to protect rather than harm. What will you do now? Ezra asked as he helped Jed to his feet. Once you've healed up, I mean. Jed gazed northward, toward distant mountains painted gold by the afternoon sun. Somewhere in that direction, Nahimana led her people toward a new beginning. I have a promise to keep, he said simply. Ezra followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered features. The Apache woman, she means something to you. It wasn't a question, but Jed answered anyway. Yes, though I'm not sure I could explain what exactly. Sometimes the most important things defy explanation, Ezra observed with unexpected wisdom. Like why an old blacksmith would risk his neck collecting evidence against powerful men, or why a former chaplain would stand with Apache against his own kind. Jed smiled faintly despite his pain. Perhaps we're not as complicated as we think. Perhaps we simply recognize truth when we see it, and can't turn away once we do. Philosophy from Jedediah Sullivan, Ezra chuckled. Now I've heard everything. They moved slowly toward the horses, Jed leaning on Ezra for support. The old blacksmith helped him mount, then swung into his own saddle. North then? He asked, nodding toward the mountains. North, Jed confirmed. But first I need to heal, and there are matters to settle in Serpent's Fork. His cabin by Eagle Creek was likely still standing, a place to recover his strength before the journey ahead. The wound in his side would need time to mend, and winter was approaching, making mountain travel increasingly treacherous. It might be spring before he could fulfill his promise to find Nahimana in the northern camps. Yet as they rode away from the ruined settlement, Jed felt no impatience. The path ahead was clear, even if the journey would be long. For the first time in years, he had purpose beyond mere survival, and perhaps, if he was fortunate, a chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of his former life. The medicine pouch Nahimana had given him rested against his chest, a tangible reminder of their connection and the bridge they had begun to build between their worlds. Whatever came next, Jed knew with quiet certainty that their paths were destined to cross again. As if in confirmation, a hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the smoky air. A message from the spirits, Nahimana would have said. Jed found himself smiling up at the bird, no longer dismissing such notions as superstition. Perhaps there were many paths to truth, many ways of understanding the world's mysteries. Perhaps the God he had once served and the spirits Nahimana honored were not so different after all, different faces of the same divine presence that moved through all living things. It was a thought that would have scandalized his younger self, the earnest chaplain with his rigid theological certainties. But that man was gone, burned away in the fires of experience, and reborn in the crucible of choice. The man in black will burn the world and rebuild it from ashes. As they rode north toward Eagle Creek, Jed pondered Akule's prophecy anew. Perhaps his fulfillment was not something grand and terrible, but something small and personal. The burning away of false beliefs, the patient rebuilding of a single life dedicated to truth rather than comforting lies. Or perhaps prophecies like dreams were doorways through which one walked without knowing the journey had begun, pathways to possibilities rather than predestined outcomes. Either way, Jed Sullivan rode forward with a lighter heart than he had carried in years, his face turned toward distant mountains and the promise they held. The world might still be burning, but from its ashes, something new could rise, something built on understanding rather than hatred, on bridges rather than barriers, on the courage to face truth no matter how painful. It was enough for now. It was a beginning.